Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to those joining us from the Americas, just starting out your day. We are delighted that you have taken time to join us once again this Tuesday for the Global Compact for Migration webinar series, which is part of a certificate program that is co-organized by the Cross-Refugee Center for the Cross-Regional Center for Refugees and Migrants, CCRM, the Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism, GRFDT, the International Institute for Migration and Development, Metropolis Asia Pacific, as well as the Migrant Forum in Asia. And for today, we are delighted to have our moderator and host for this GCM webinar on Global Compact for Migration, objective number 13. Interesting, we've come to 13 already, quite a long ride since we started off in September. And today we will be focusing on alternatives to detention. And we are in the able hands of our moderator, Ms. Judy Yazbek, hope I pronounced it very well, who is from the Cross-Regional Center for Refugees and Migrants. And she's a Lebanese lawyer and activist, and also in her role as the Regional and Advocacy Officer at CCRM. Judy, we are so glad that you're here with us and that you are going to moderate this session, and I'll be handing over to you. Thank you, and over to you, Judy.
Thank you, Paddy, for this introduction, and I'm very happy to be with you all today. I will start without further ado. So the objective 13 of the GCM is the use immigration detention only as a measure of last resort and work towards alternatives. While there must be a legal basis for detention, for it to be lawful, and while the objective 13 provides that detention should be non-arbitrary, which means that the grounds of detention in the law itself should provide that detention provide that detention must be necessary, reasonable, and proportionate in an individual case. And while this objective explicitly states that governments should be working towards the implementation of alternatives of detentions, the objective itself, ironically, is somehow compromising in a sense that there is a linkage between migration and detention. So the linkage is present, and it's like the migration, a certain pillar of the migration should be detention, which should not be the case. So this is why I would love to hear your opinions about that and thoughts later on. But this is why I think it's very important to discuss alternatives to migrations, to detention. So for now, let's welcome our speakers. So we have with us Mr. Michael Flynn, the Executive Director of Global Detention Project, Mrs. Sumita Krishna, Director of the Our Journey NGO in Malaysia, and Mr. Manfred Bergmann, which is an eminent migration expert. So I will start with introducing Mr. Flynn. So Michael is the Executive Director of the Global Detention Project based in Geneva, Switzerland. He is the co-author with Isabella Majder and Mariette Grange of Immigration Detention in the European Union in the shadow of the crisis, Springer 2020, and co-editor of Challenging Immigration Detention, Academics, Activists, and Policymakers, Edward Elgar, 2017. Michael previously worked as a project director at the Institute of Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., as a project coordinator for the program for the study of global migration at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and as an associate editor of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists in Chicago. His research have been supported by the Swiss Network for International Studies, the Geneva International Academy Network, the PW International Journalism Program, and the Fund for Investigative Journalism. Michael holds a BA in philosophy from DePaul University and a PhD in international studies from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. So Michael, thank you so much for being with us today. And to start in a bit of a philosophical way of thinking, do you think is there an alternative to liberty? And could you please tell us more about what you see as challenges and unintended consequences linked to protecting migrants' rights to liberty through promoting alternatives to detention? The floor is yours, Michael, please.
Hi, thank you very much for that long introduction. And thank you very much for inviting me to be with you all today. It's a real pleasure to have this opportunity to address a topic that I think is very important, especially as we look down the line later this year to the review conference and some of the objectives that we hope to come out of that. I'll be brief with my comments initially, and then we can come back around to questions to try to pull things apart. But I suppose I could start by saying that I've long been concerned about the way in which the Compact for Migration bakes in a concept of promoting alternatives to detention as a cornerstone of promoting the right to liberty of migrants. And my concern is rooted in the fact that the right to liberty is something that should only be taken away from somebody because of very exceptional circumstances, as you pointed out, Judy. However, when we look at concepts like alternatives to detention, they have very little meaning, in fact, and they can change dramatically from one place to the next. And the only really solid meaning of that term and that phrase is one that is related to challenging arbitrary detention of people. And so the concept of alternatives is used broadly, as it was very recently in the Committee on Migrant Workers General Comment number 5 on the right to liberty of migrants, which many of you may be familiar with. They properly define it, I think properly define it as a legal mechanism that allows people or allows for all detention decisions to be challenged, or at least to be put to a test on whether or not they're necessary and proportionate. And this way, alternatives to detention serve as a way to remove or prevent arbitrary detention. And that's what I think our focus should be. Our focus should be preventing arbitrary detention, because I think if we do that properly, we can squeeze and limit the use of detention in the case of migrants and asylum seekers and other vulnerable non-citizens. Instead, what we have today is a global movement around a term that locks in the notion of detention, right? I mean, words are important. I think we can begin with first principles here. And the first principle here is the words alternatives to detention lock in the concept of detention as if it were somehow a element inherent in all of our rights, but that's actually not the case. What is inherent is liberty. And I think that we have lost focus. And I think that, unfortunately, the phrasing of the Compact for Migration has baked that concept in. And I think it's deeply disconcerting. And I also think it's unnecessary. I think there are much other ways in which we can strategize around preventing and eliminating arbitrary detention of migrants and asylum seekers and others. So I'm happy to unpack some of those ideas as the panel progresses, but I'll leave my comments there for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael, for your enlightening comments. And I'm sure that we will be going into more details throughout this conversation. But for now, I will be moving to Mr. Manfred Bergmann. So Manfred is an Italian social worker, a language teacher, a researcher, a translator, a campaign activist for the rights of migrants, refugees, and vulnerable groups and individuals, locally and at UN level, in collaboration with several ECOSOC NGOs. He attended many appointments on the Global Forum on Migration and Development, the People's Global Action of NGOs at GFMD from 2006, and to many sessions to the UN Council for Human Rights from 2000 as an NGO representative. He's the director of CADI, Comito Antirazzista, Durban, Italia. So please correct me, Manfred, whenever you will speak. He worked with various NGOs and the EU projects, MSF, HRW, MRI, MFA, CCRM, and others, as a project worker and manager, and as an author and trainer for several projects of ILO and IOM, European Commission, Interior and External Affairs Ministries for sheltering, orienting and integrating refugees and migrants. He spent 30 years as a language teacher and legal orientator while visiting shelters, jail, detention centers, shelters, communities of migrants and refugees, and projects in Europe and the world. So Manfred, thank you so much for being with us. I would love to hear about your experience because we all know that you are a migration expert. So could you please tell us more about alternative to detentions in your region?
Yes, I tell you, starting what is my opinion on alternative detentions. I think the best alternative is freedom. And that's the point. But the point we should raise is you cannot detained because you are a migrant. So if it happens that in my country I am catched on the road with a migrant friend, it happens that if I don't have my documents in my pocket and he or she doesn't have as well the documents in the pocket, we have two different destinies. Recognized by my familiars while being in the hands of the policeman for a few minutes or hours. But the migrant will be detained in a migration detention center because he was around without the documents. So starting from this point, we have seen many occasions of people who lost they left their documents home and then they could not go back home where there was even the family. You know that in my country, but also in yours, there are many undocumented migrants who risk their life for providing us of food, vegetables, services while we survive to the COVID. You know that in Europe we have many problems. The first is not migration. So this is the common paradigm. No? The migrants have to be detained because we cannot keep them in a home in this country because they are foreigners. So we don't develop a system of shelters and we put them in prison. Now, if you think it's possible that I share the screen for I will show you some typologies of facilities where people are detained. So
Sure,
I click on sharing the screen, but the organizer has disability. Okay, it's not.
Can you try now?
Yes, I try now.
Thank you.
Yes, very good.
It works. Great.
This is the typology. Many places where we detain people in Europe. And the names of these places can be very different. They don't call them jails. They call them pre-removal detention center, as they do in Austria. Or pre-removal detention center in another country, in Belgium. Immigration detention center, so only for migrants. Then pre-removal newly, then detention pending deportation center. If you see on the right, there is even the number of the people who were detained in such a situation. So for every European country, we find a different name of places where we can detain arbitrarily means without the intervention of a tribunal, a judge, somebody who can reasonably decide if you have to be in jail or not. Then there is administrative detention center. You see, this is very peaceful, this name, no? Administration, we administer these things, no? Then this is beautiful foreigners, but they detain people there. And this is not only a place like in these, in Hungary, no. It happens also in my country, in Italy. Then we have Italy, yes, we have these places. Now there is 1/5 place. The conditions are not great, as we documented with the Human Rights Watch in some reports. I collaborated from Libyan jails, and we documented, I tell you, about 10 years ago. In a report we documented with interview hundreds of people who told us what is the system combined, organized between Libya, Malta, Italy. And then now we have studies of good journalists, for example, Nello Scave from Avvenire, who are proving between secret services, mafia, and the Libyan detention center system, with the help of my government and the help of the European countries. So another way to detain people is called the place directly identification and expulsion center. Detention center guarded the center for asylum seekers. Okay, you judge deciding that you are there, and you are an asylum seeker. So, in a certain sense, you are a refugee, because until when it is proved that you are not a refugee, you have to be treated like a refugee. Maybe you are a victim of torture. Maybe you are coming from some trauma. Maybe you would need some language courses instead of walls. Then. There is a lot of very original removal detention center and immigration removal center, like they do in UK, with a large number of people and a big number of centers like that. So what to say? This is only about the arbitrary detention, the one that is dedicated to asylum seekers or people who have to be recognized and or expelled. But if we are going in the real prisons, jails, I tell you, there is some problems about legal mediation, orientation, language teaching, social assistance, intercultural mediation, something that could really fight the criminality. So what to say? Let's stop for these initial points, and thank you.
So thank you very much, Manfred, for your intervention. As mentioned by you and Michael, liberty and freedom should be the alternative to detention. And thank you also for shedding the light around the topic of discrimination between migrants and local detention and the locals on detention issues, and also the terminology of the centers, detention centers, was very also enlightening for us. So we will be talking more about this while advancing. But for now, let's welcome Sumita Krishna. Please correct me if I didn't say the name in a proper way. So Sumita Shantini Krishna is an advocate and solicitor and the sole proprietor of Chambers of Sumita. She holds an LLB from University of East London, and she was called to the Malaysian bar in 2005. She is qualified mediator and on the mediators panel of the Bar Council Malaysian Mediator Center. She is the director of Our Journey, an NGO platform for experts on migration issues to advocate government and private stakeholders to develop a supportive migration system for non-citizens, incorporated with the international standards and norms. Sumita is the current chairperson of Migrant Forum in Asia, a regional network with membership in 18 countries from Middle East and Asia, advocating for the protection of migrant workers. Sumita serves in many national, regional, and international groups, coalitions, networks to advocate for the protection and rights of migrants, domestic workers, refugees, asylum seekers, stateless persons, trafficked persons, and foreign spouses, as well as foreign nationals on death row. So Sumita, welcome, and thank you for joining us today and providing us with your valuable inputs on the GCM Objective 13, Alternative to Detention.
Thank you.
So Sumita, based on your experience, can you share with us your perspective on detention? What is evident in Asian countries?
Okay, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the panel. I just want to say that as an activist, I am totally against detention of migrants who come in for labor. I'm in a destination country. I'm in a prominent destination country, which has almost about 4 to 5 million migrant workers serving here. And it makes up almost about 30% of the workforce in Malaysia. And I am against detention for 2 reasons. One is the documentation process in Malaysia, or even in any other country, it is very dependent on the employer. Even if the worker wants to document himself or herself, they're not able to do that without the intervention of the employer. And even in legalization processes, we have many legalization processes in Malaysia, and you will see that the worker cannot legalize himself if the employer does not help him to do so, right? So you have a system where the worker cannot legalize himself, but then you put the burden on the worker to remain documented, and I feel, and then you always punish the worker for not being documented, but he's not able to do that, right? Secondly, for the longest time that I can remember, detention has been used to instill fear in the migrant so that they do not complain about their abusive work environment. They don't complain about their abusive employer. We do a lot of cases and we see migrants just stuck in that abusive, exploitative situation because they are so fearful that if they leave that situation, they will be subjected to detention. So the detention has not deterred the number of migrants becoming undocumented. It has not deterred migrants from coming into the country undocumented. All it has done is facilitated trafficking. It has facilitated employers to continue to exploit migrants. So these are some of the main reasons why I think we should not support detention of migrants. So this is why I don't even see it fit that we should have alternative to detention for migrant labor. I have seen this in Malaysia where so many migrants were detained over a long period of time. But when the pandemic hit, we saw the change in policy where the government suddenly took a stand and said that, okay, we're not going to detain anyone. Let everyone stay until a certain time. You're given, you will be allowed to legalize yourself, get your work permits done and all that. Why couldn't you do this before? Why did it take a pandemic for you to change your policy? So it can be done. You can give the opportunity for workers to leave the country without being detained, or allow the workers to stay in the country without being detained. But does it mean that you have to wait for a pandemic for that to happen? And the only reason why the government changed their stand was they couldn't cope with the number of persons in the detention, and there was serious outbreak of COVID in the detention. That was the only reason why they changed their policy. But it is possible to change the policy if you want to, you know. So I think this is something that we must look at around the world. Countries who have stepped up and given legalization for migrants who otherwise they wouldn't have given, you know, so that they could access health care, or they could access vaccination, you know. So there were change of policy around the world, and so it's possible. And I think that's what we should be advocating. And we cannot advocate, I will not advocate for alternative for detention for immigration offenses. I will advocate for no detention for immigration offenses, because it's not the fault of the migrant. We see enough cases in Malaysia and in Asia country. I think you would have seen in how in Singapore, when the COVID broke out, they saw it fit to detain workers in the hostels, right? And they detained them for over a year. Is that even? I can't even say that it's a right thing to do, or it's a terrible thing to do. The COVID was over, all your other citizens were walking around, but you still saw it fit to detain these migrant workers over a year in that hostel. You know, so there were different types of detention taking place. And I think we have to look at it in different perspective. Sometimes they say, yes, we have to do detention at borders so that we have to deal with terrorism and all those kind of things. But are they doing that? Are they actually doing that, or are they using that as an excuse to stop migrant labor, or, you know, people who need assistance at the border, refugees, for example? You know, there should be some differentiation, isn't it? But no, you detain everyone, and then you're trying to figure out whether this person is eligible for refugee status, asylum, and so on and so forth, right? And I think it's not like before. People are on the move. People have the right to move. People have the right to seek a better living abroad. And if you cannot facilitate that process, and I see a lot of countries having so much of restrictions, so much of red tape for migrants to go abroad. Philippines, Bangladesh, they promote migration to their citizens to go abroad and work, but they are so restrictive for them to actually access that services to go abroad. So what do the migrant does? They go through smuggling. They are trafficked. You know, you should be opening more channels for them to migrate. Don't make the process so difficult. Don't have so much of red tapes. You know, and then at the same time, you do not provide enough employment at your own home country, and then you tell the migrant to go over, tell your citizen to go abroad. You know, so I think these are things that we need to challenge. The countries that are imposing this kind of laws on their citizens. I welcome migration, but we must make sure that we do not promote something that the government is trying to use it in a different way. Detention is not something that the government has used in a right way. And I agree with Michael when they say that alternative detention is also another form of detention. You know, children in detention. Why do you keep children in detention? I even see here, the migrant is leaving the country and they're detaining them at the borders. Why? The migrant is leaving the country. What do you gain out of bringing back the migrant and putting him in this country in detention? If he's going away out of the country, let him go. You know, you have already got his, taken all his bio data, his biometric, everything you have taken already. So if you want him you want to prevent him from coming in illegally, you can do that later. But don't detain them and then keep them here, make them serve sentence and then try to deport them. Sometimes it doesn't make sense how the deportation process work around the country. Yeah. So let me stop here. I will give the floor back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Sumita, for your valuable contribution. It's very important to focus on what you just said. So the aspect of being undocumented. As you said, it is not up to the worker to be documented or not. It's rather in the employer's hands, and it's the employer's responsibility. Yet the migrant worker is the one who is being detained for being undocumented. So this is something very enlightening and very to think about as we go forward. And another aspect also was, as you said, there were some good practices regarding to health and access to health in general, and access to vaccination by undocumented migrants. For example, I would say that in Lebanon, we had seen this practice. So the ministry, the relevant ministry was taking into hands to get the undocumented migrants to get the vaccines whenever they wanted to. But it's like you said, it shouldn't be related to a pandemic. These should be rules that we always work on and advocate for, and they should be in place already. So now I will go over also to Michael. I will go over to you, Michael. So if you could just tell us about what you think about the cause that makes migration and detention go together, for example. And if you can give us, I know that you said that you are against, but if you can give us examples on alternative to detention as well.
Hi, thank you for the comments, Manfred and Sunita. It's interesting to actually see that list of all those different names of detention centers across Europe. It does give you a real sense of what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with something that, in most cases, countries don't really want to call it what it is, and I think we should ask ourselves why. I think it's really important that we sit back and go, why is it that a country would want to call all these different places where they lock people up something that doesn't make you think that they're locking them up? But what's also equally important is that when you go from what Manfred presented to what Sumita presented, we're talking about two very different parts of the world. And so not only is it really weird to understand what European countries are calling this, it's also very odd to try to think about, is this the same thing happening in Europe that's happening in Malaysia, that's happening in Singapore? And arguably it's not the same thing. Arguably the differences are so big that we have to sit back and reconsider what our definitions of this is. At its base, there is something common amongst all these things, and that is people being locked up, people being deprived of their liberty. And so I think that's where we need to begin. What is it? Why are we meeting here today to talk about this? And we're meeting here today to talk about this. And I think it's really important to clarify this, especially building on what Sumita has said, is that there is an effort there's been a global effort to try to stop this growth of this detention of migrants. And it's been ongoing for decades now. And a key focus of this effort, both locally and internationally, has been this campaign called Alternative to Detention. And it's too bad that Hannah isn't here, because Hannah represents an NGO, the International Detention Coalition, which is a coalition of groups all over the world that has been instrumental in promoting this concept and promoting this movement, as it were, campaign. And so she would be the person really best to speak about different examples of how this has worked or how it may not have worked, or in which context it works or doesn't. And in fact, just today, the IDC released a strategy paper on this issue, which I was hoping we were going to engage on today with Hannah on the panel. So I regret that she's not here. But I think what's really important for us to understand is that while there's a reason for us to be here to talk about alternatives to detention, there's also reason for us to be concerned about what the unintended consequences of this concept, of this campaign are. So, and I think we need to really pick it apart a little bit. What does it mean in the context of Europe is going to mean something very different than what it means in Malaysia, for instance. It's really hard to understand something like alternative detention in both places as if it were the same thing, because it's really not. And yet there's a global movement about this thing, alternative to detention. And my principal concern has been that while there's a reason for it to exist, this campaign, it has some potentially very negative unintended consequences. And those are that they, in effect, equate a concept, an undefined concept, ATD, with migration management, with the appropriate treatment of migrants and asylum seekers arriving in countries, as if alternatives to detention, ATD, actually were the global concept for migration management. And I don't know if anyone else in this audience is concerned about that, but for me, if the global movement to treat people properly is called alternatives to detention, that for me is a bit like saying, wait a minute, I mean, we have, is the cart ahead of the horses here? Why are we talking about the appropriate treatment and the concept of detention at all? You know, and unfortunately, to my light, this campaign was so effective in the lead up to the adoption of the GCM that it's become a principal cornerstone of the GCM itself. And that's why in my earlier comments, I mentioned it's baked in. So we have a concept here that we have to confront, no matter whether we like it or not. And so what are we going to do to try to prevent what could be some potentially very negative consequences here? And I think that's our task here today. And as we lead up to the review conference, is what do we do to take this concept and turn it back around to be something that emphasizes the right to liberty, and rather than emphasizes the notion of the detainability of everybody, which is what ATD kind of means. We're all detainable somehow. And so how do we turn this around? You know, so we have the compact, it's written, it's done, you know, and all kinds of efforts like this one are being done to try to build on it so that we can protect the rights of migrants. And yet we have a concept here that is so unwieldy that it's dangerous. And I think, and I'll transition in a second to something maybe a little bit more constructive, but I think ultimately what happens here is if this concept continues to unfold and become the dominant spearhead of it, as it were, of efforts to promote the rights of migrants, what you're going to have is something that is so Orwellian in nature. You're going to have not detention systems anymore. You're going to have alternative to detention systems. And what those alternative detention systems are going to be are different kinds of detention called alternatives to detention. And in fact, you already see that a little bit. You already see in countries like the United States where they use ankle bracelets and they call it alternative to detention. There's the danger. Therein lies the danger. If you look at some of the strategy documents, campaign documents that describe the concept, they're very unclear about, well, they're actually very clear about who should be subject to ATD. And they say it's everybody. They say it. Everybody who's potentially vulnerable to detention should be given ATD. What does that mean? Well, that translates for countries as, well, let's create an ATD bureaucracy so that we can surveil everybody. So in some ways, ATD is like the expansion of the surveillance state. I don't think that that's what the campaign wants, but I could see how that's what it's going to get, you know, and where you have, in the case of, say, Malaysia, where you have 30% of the workforce as being migrants, and you have some forms of mandatory detention in place. There may be a role for the concept of alternative detention if you say that, in fact, everyone is subject to detention. And maybe we then need to find some alternative way to get people out of that mandatory detention. There may be a legal concept that makes sense there, but in the context of Europe, I don't see why it makes sense, because in most cases, in fact, across the European Union, there has to be in law and policy something in place that makes detention that is used as a last measure, right? And it's not that it's always been used that way, but it's built into the concept already that you can't put someone in detention if there's some other means to achieve the ends of migration policy. And that's where the role of alternative detention understood as a legal concept comes into play. And that brings us back to what I think we should be fighting for, which is preventing arbitrary detention. And what is arbitrary detention? Well, there's a lot of good work done on this. It's people that are forced to go in detention without an individual legal assessment of whether or not it's necessary, proportionate. It's where people are being put in detention and there is no grounds for doing so. You know, these are all forms these are all arbitrary forms of detention, and that should be the focus of our work instead of some concept called alternative to detention. So and I'll leave on just something constructive. I've always thought, and I do see that a lot of the campaign literature around ATDs is evolving to take into account some of these concerns. I think what we really need is not a campaign in ATDs, but a campaign that says in each country situation, which are different from around the world, what are the opportunities we have that exist already in the law, for instance, that may give us some way to build a movement. And so in some countries, there are grounds in law to not detain unaccompanied minors, citizens and non-citizens alike. Why aren't we looking at what countries have those provisions in law and saying, instead of saying alternative to detention for children, we're saying, look, your law says you don't detain these children. Instead, what we should be doing is financing the work of social welfare institutions that help those children, not financing some immigration bureau to do an ATD campaign, which is going to be eventually some form of detention. So I think an assessment carefully of each country and where its situation is, both in the migration phenomena and also its legal setting, gives us an opportunity to see where we have opportunities to promote a more rigorous challenge to detention measures and thus prevent arbitrary detention. It's difficult. It's hard to conceive of a global campaign on that scope because it becomes very individualized and very, very tied to the empirical situation of individual countries. But I think that's where we must be. That's where you're going to build your cases against, where you have some lawyers that are doing very good work trying to get people out of detention. It creates exemplary cases. That's where it is. My concern is, how do these concepts become folded in to efforts to move on as we approach the review conference that's coming up? And I don't have all those answers. But I'm hoping maybe some people in the audience do. So I'll end my comments there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Michael, for your really valuable input here. So as you mentioned, I think it's very important to focus on the legal framework that already exists in a country and go from there. So whenever we have good laws, to really focus on these laws and to implement them in a way that they are binding to the country, because as you said, the legal frameworks are different from one country to the other. Another thing that I would also like to comment on is that, as you said, that while there is a global movement on alternative to detention, it is somehow, as you mentioned, it has somehow a negative impact, since the emphasis should be on the right to liberty and to access liberty rather than emphasizing on the notion of alternative as to being detained. So focusing on that, I would love for Manfred to also give us some success stories, maybe, so around the alternative to detention or also bad practices. So Manfred, while adapting to the alternative to detention is one aspect of adherence to international best practice. How do you measure success in this term? And what does an evaluation process look like? Do you think that migrants' viewpoints is included? Or is it just the viewpoint of governments?
Well, the question is very good, and I need time to answer. For first, I would say that yes, there is this identification with migration as a danger, as a public danger, no? So the detention is the answer of a government that is not enough democratic. Okay, that's the point we this problem. Then there is also the problem that we don't have to mitigate arbitrary detention of migrants. We have to eradicate the detention of migrants because they are migrants. And this is unacceptable. So what is the framework where we have to move? On one side, it is, but the global compact, it is not only a problem of language, it's also a problem of contents. In the global compact, we cannot put human rights at the center, because this is not the context where movements do meet for defending human rights. The real context where world movements in human rights is the Council for Human Rights at United Nations. And that is binding. But the Global Compact is not binding. So this is two different contexts, and we have to operate in both the contexts. The problem of the Global Compact is that it spreaded too fast between refugees and migrants. NGOs working with refugees were separated from the NGOs working with migrants. So when we work with the Global Compact on migration, we cannot refer to some basic rights of the migrants that are discussed in the refugee parts of the Global Compact, and vice versa. Okay? So, divide et impera in Latin is an important phrase. It means divide the NGOs who are defending migrants from the NGOs who are defending refugees, and keep them far from the NGOs who are defending indigenous people. They were together until the 2002. Then with the reform of the Human Rights Commission at UN, they were separated forever. So you don't have a place where indigenous people, migrants and refugees do meet with governments and say all together, please, because they just can't say please. So the Council for Human Rights is theoretically the place where this happens, and NGOs are working more there. Amnesty International is working there, Human Rights Watch is working there, Médecins Sans Frontières is working there, trade unions are working there for fighting for human rights. The Global Compact is an association that is becoming more and more united. That started in 2006. I was in Belgium with the NGOs preparing the first PGAs, and then during the development of the Global Forum on Migration and Development, Sumita remembers, Patricia Ganza remembers, this is people who I met there. We had always the perception that the Global Forum for Migration and Development was a festival of and not the place where we protect human rights at a world level. So what to do? We have the Council for Human Rights, we have the Global Forum on Migration that now became something that we call the Global Compact, but during the while the functions of the International Organization of Migration became central, and now they have the protection of the rights of migrants that they never asked. And they cannot. So I write guides for migrants who can read them when they are in jail or in detention centers while learning Italian and legal orientation. And I see that they are arrested and they even don't know why. They need a lawyer and they don't know what is a lawyer, how to use it in a different language, with the interpreters who are maneuvered by the embassies of the countries. And in this situation, you see that the poor is, of course, inside the detention center, and the rich is outside in a few hours. No? So the system should be shelter systems that are not detention centers, that can host people who have to be retraced but not detained. This is things. In Europe, this is the solution. But governments have to be very democratic. The personnel included in such projects should be depending not from interior ministry, but from NGOs and institutions of the government, mixed with a good training that should start from human rights of people hosted, because many of the people are minors, many are women, many are traumatized, many are in rehabilitation, many people don't even know how to explain what happened to them. No? Let's conclude. We have to fight in the global compact so that the partnerships and the bilateral agreements can help people to raise education, health, development we need, no? And then to rethink our future development, because we cannot teach fishing everybody. We have to rethink fishing because the fish is finished. So ecologically, we have to transform the society. If we don't want to build big mental health hospitals, it's better we improve so that we can host mental health patients in the society and not in the mental health psychiatric hospitals closed, detained. And this is the same with all minorities, of course, with migrants as well. No? I remember when I was 18 years old, they sent me to the army and I had to lock inside the jail the Jehovah Witness of Christians who refused to participate to the army. So I think I met these people, I tell you, very peaceful people, very good people. They just study, they don't even watch women, you know, they are very caste people. So these people were forced to be in a jail for 2 years because they didn't want to serve the army for 1 year. The reason detained are many, no? Sometimes is even religious. Maybe your name is Islam. Stop that man. That man is called Islam. Please have a check. No, only because your name. No. So at this point, we have to reform the society. We have to ask to the Global Compact to give, to sponsor partnerships, but not secret, please. Open partnerships, because secret partnerships are not good. And we have to ask, in this sense, not the reduction, short reduction, or rethink, or modernization, or privatization of detention. This is not the point. This is not what we want. We want the eradication of detention of migrants because they are migrants. This is not a good reason to be. Thank you, my friends.
Thank you, Manfred, for always putting valuable comments and valuable inputs. So as you mentioned, the GCM should be focusing really on the eradication of detention of migrants per se. And on alternative to detention, we can also focus on ways like creating shelters, for example, shelter systems managed from NGOs and institutions from the government with good trainings, as you mentioned, while rethinking our future developments as well. So I will move now to Sumita. Sumita, I wanted to ask you that throughout this pandemic, we have also seen a lot of migrants become undocumented, unfortunately. And despite all the World Health Organization's recommendations and some amnesty laws in certain countries, we have seen thousands of migrants put into detention, which led to the question, are we really getting to the implementation of the compact? So I wanted to ask you, how about the extensive work we see on alternatives to detention on labor issues? How can those engage with migrants' protection concerns? And if you can also shed the light on the situation in Malaysia, that would be great. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Let me quickly first start by saying that everybody was so excited by the GCM, in the initial stage. But I think, unfortunately, but as expected, the civil society participation was very restrictive. And I think we were not able to give enough input into the provisions. And I think it's quite disappointing that we actually have a provision on alternative to detention in the GCM itself. I felt that if we actually played the governments who were very pro detention actually won in this sense. So, and also I think you need to look at detention in another aspect, is that if you think migration is a big business, detention is another big business. In Asia, we have a lot of countries where they have detention centers. On the outside, it looks as if the government is running the detention centers, but a lot of the facilities inside the detention centers are privatized, and they make a lot of money from detention centers. And I think that is also one of the factors why a lot of governments support detention, because it is a money-making venture for a lot of countries, including mine. So I think that's something that we need to question as well. Not only about privatization of healthcare, but also privatization of detention centers. In terms of, yes, we saw a lot of work by a lot of alternative to detention in our region, but I think it was really difficult because there are a lot of countries that do not have alternative to detention. They only had detention. Even when they spoke about alternative to detention, it was another form of detention. And so I personally, or rather my organization, was not able to support those kind of advocacy work because I didn't see the value in taking the migrant from one detention center and putting him into another detention center, and then changing and saying that it's being run by the NGO or it's being run by a government-funded facility or something to that effect. It just didn't make sense, And I'm just going to reiterate, I'm totally against immigration detention. And like what Michael said, that you don't give the opportunity to the migrant to even state his case, and then you're putting him in detention. It doesn't make sense at all. Arbitrary detention is totally wrong. Yeah. So in the context of Malaysia, we are very, very, how do you say, we do a lot of detention of migrants. We detain migrants for every little thing. The law in Malaysia is very archaic and it's very strict, and it will, and you just have to have mere suspicion, and you can detain someone. You don't even have to have evidence. And that is something that they used very, very extensively against migrants. I don't see them using them against criminal and all that, but against migrants, that's what they do. I feel that is because migrants are foreign nationals. They're citizens, and they lack support. They lack legal representation, legal support, and this is exactly why they are more vulnerable compared to citizens. Yeah. So, but I just feel that I do not want to. If we have a space where we have to speak about migration, I don't even want to speak about alternative to migration in the context of alternative to detention in the context of migration. We should be talking about no detention at all. And I hope in future discussions with the government or any documents that come out, we should be advocating for that. I felt that we missed that opportunity in the GCM. Totally missed that opportunity in the GCM. And it's so unfortunate. And now we're having a seminar on this on GCM 13, unfortunately. So yeah, that's my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Sumita, first of all, for your inputs and overview of the Malaysian side of the ATDs in general. And I totally agree with you, Michael and Manfred, that we should be talking about eradication, about the alternative to detention, and rather speaking about liberty and the right to access liberty for migrants and non-migrants. I think that we can right now move to comments and any comments or questions from participants with us. So if anyone has comments or questions about the topic, everything discussed, please, you can proceed by raising your hands.
Hi, Judy. You also have some questions in the chat, so maybe we can take some of the questions in the chat. Yeah.
I was going to quickly follow up on a couple, if I may, a couple of the comments in the chat.
Please go ahead, Michael. Thank you.
So there's a couple here that are some questions, I guess, that could be to all of us, but which I think merit just pulling apart a little bit. I think one here is about why I think who is it asks is why are countries very resistant to reform? I think is kind of what the sentence is. Why does it seem so attractive to more and more countries, the concept of detention? And I think those are two very interesting things to look at in this context, because they also they're challenges that also point to potential opportunities. So on the one hand, as Sumita has made clear, that this is a big business, right? And it's a big business that very big companies are involved in, and also little companies. You know, I bet you some of the detention centers that Sumita's talking about, people providing services, may be just a small shop. You know, who knows? It could be someone that does the laundry or that does the cleaning or that does, but they're all little small private businesses. And they create economies around the entire effort, right? And those economies also bake in a certain agenda or a certain policy that becomes very hard to unentangle once it becomes embedded so broadly, both in the small businesses, the larger businesses, and in the government bureaucracies that are built up to actually implement these policies, detention policies, or alternative to detention policies, as it may be in some places. So I think that's one reason why it's very difficult to push reforms. But I think the other reason is also another reason that's really important is because, and another reason that's a really big challenge for the ATD campaign is that so much of the detention that's emerging today is happening in countries that often aren't even the destination of migrant labor, you know, or asylum seekers or refugees, but rather countries that are, to use the common parlance, transit countries. You know, that people are transiting those countries to get from where they're at to someplace else. And it's in those countries where there is an effort by wealthy countries to stop the movement of people. And you know, the two most notorious cases in the European context are Libya and Turkey, right? And so here you have two countries where there's an enormous amount of financing flowing in from Europe that is often not necessarily earmarked exactly for this or that activity, but we kind of know what's going on. And a lot of it is basically an effort to build up detention capabilities, right? And so that's a really important reason why we see so much detention and why it's very difficult to unravel it or to push back against it, because powerful countries are pushing other countries to do it, right? And so that's a real challenge. And that's also one reason why detention seems to spread so much and so easily. That's why you have this diffusion of detention practices outwards from wealthier countries to countries that may not have those resources, but they're being paid to do it. And then I think another question here that came up that I think is very important for us to address is who's subject to this detention. I see that there's a question in there about this. And I think this is also very important because in the alternative to detention literature, they say ATDs are for all people vulnerable to detention. And that's kind of a difficult concept to get to talk about, I think, because that's kind of everybody at some point, right? In the context of international migration, I think what they mean is people who are coming into a country who don't have appropriate papers, or who, according to the laws, don't have appropriate papers, right? And so are undocumented or irregular, or as some national legal systems say, illegal. No matter how offensive we may find that term is also quite used in the law in many countries. So as a result, you have this large population of people who could presumably be subject to detention. And so often it's not clear who's going to fall into a detention situation, but it should be. The national legal system should be very clear about this. And and this leads to my last point I want to make in one of the questions here in the sidebar is, should we be rewriting GCM 13 to talk about abolition? And I would caution about moving in that direction. And I think, Sumita, one of the things that happened in the conversations, and I don't know the adoption of it, but I think that what happened here is that there seems to be this false dichotomy of either you have abolition or you have ATDs, as if those were the only two options out there. And I think that a savvy third option is one which says, well, states are going to be states. They're going to retain power over who can come and go across their borders. And we're kidding ourselves if that's going to go away. That's not going to go away. What we need to do is somehow, as civil society, as human rights promoters, as migrant rights advocates, find ways in which we can push against the use of that power. So I think pushing for a straight out abolition will not work. And that's why ATDs seem to be so clever, because it seemed to promote human rights of people and non-detention ideas in a way without calling for abolition. But I think that in the end, it's built a solution that becomes a kind of a monster of its own, where it has a lot of momentum and could lead to results that we could all regret down the line. So what I think is a way in which we should be seeing this is we should be insisting that the only time someone has ever found themselves in detention, in custody for any length of time, is because a state has proved beyond any measure of a doubt that there's a real reason for that and that it's not arbitrary. That's why I think, and that's where I think the general comment number 5 on migrants' right to liberty for the Committee on Migrant Workers is a very good read in this respect. And I put up a link here in the sidebar for people if they want to go look at that. Because it really refocuses our attention on arbitrary detention. Because if we do a good job at pushing it back against arbitrary detention, I think we'll find means to start to roll back detention itself. That should be our focus. And that's going to be an effort that's going to change from country to country. Those are my comments. Thanks.
Could I just quickly add something to what Michael mentioned? I want to support what he said, and also the fact that detention is a money-making business. And I'm going to give you 2 examples. Whenever I go into detention to meet my client, the officials at the detention center always will approach the lawyers to ask them if they want to buy anything for their client. And the cost of what we're buying is almost 6-7 times more than what you can get outside. And secondly, when I want to get my client's ticket, when he has served his sentence and he has to go out, to be deported, they always insist that I can only buy a ticket from that particular airlines. Only that airlines can give the ticket for those who are detained to fly out of the country. So what does that tell you? There's already a contract between airlines and detention centers, and it's all a money-making thing. Secondly, governments always support detentions also because to show their citizens that they're trying to protect their borders, that they care for the citizens, and they want to make sure that the citizens are safe in the country. But that's all just really, really a myth. You have to think for yourself. This kind of arguments, and in Malaysia they do this all the time. They always love to tell the citizens that we are having these detention centers. We need to build more detention centers because we have to keep these people out. It's always that same argument. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Sumita. Now I will move to everyone who is raising their hand. So I will start with Agnetti, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. You are on mute. Can you please unmute yourself?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
All right. Thank you very much. I strongly believe that the greatest challenge that migrants have is legal services. My experience shows me that sometimes there is nobody to speak on their behalf. I applaud a lot of NGOs that are trying their best on their little bits to see how they can stand in for them. But as an NGO, sometimes you need to have a license from the national government to run an NGO in a country, which means that if you want to talk tough on the government may seize your license and you cannot operate in that front. My take here is this. Can IOM and other organizations join force to have a DEX, at least one DEX per country, whereby migrants can seek redress before they throw them into jail? Because it's always a matter of you are going to jail without defending yourself, and whoever comes there to defend you is not speaking for you, he's speaking against you for the government. Like our lady Shmita said, the government want to prove to the citizens, look, we are doing something to defend you, but let's cease to know that migrants are an asset. If we see human beings as an asset, whereby you can develop them and make good use of them, then we will not throw anybody to jail because he crossed into your territory. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much, Anette, for pointing out this very important point that migrants should always be an asset and should always be an added value to the hosting country. So it's very important to note that as well. I will go in alphabetical order. So, or whoever is. So Ngozi, please go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe I will play devil's advocate here. Not that I'm supporting detention myself. I was detained somewhere in Europe for about 15 years for not having the proper document. So there is no way I will support detention. But international migration is in the sphere of international relations. And when you come to international relations, there is no sentiments, So how do we, how can government regulate those who come into their countries without a document? Because when you allow people flow in, then the migration will be inorderly and chaotic. Thank you.
Thank you, Ngozi. So if anyone wants to comment on what Ngozi said, meanwhile, I will invite to the floor Mrs. Joanne Gloria.
Thank you very much, our facilitators today and our moderator. My name is John Gloria from Kenya. I'm working at a trade union called the Kenya Union of Domestic Hotels, Education Institutions, and Hospital Workers. Now, today's
Excuse me, Joanne. Just
Yes.
Yes, your voice is much better now. I couldn't
all
hear
right.
you before. Now that's better. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Sorry for that. I had introduced myself that I'm Joan, and I'm a Kenyan. I work at a trade union known as Kutheiha. That's the Kenya Union of Domestic Hotels, Education Institutions, and Hospital Workers. I am glad to have been a student in this class, and I am learning a lot. So today's theme or topic is very relevant, and I'm glad to hear from our facilitators that we are not supporting the issue of alternative to detentions. Rather, we should be having a solution. So my question is, does all detainees or the issues of detention, does its solution always land to deportation, or could it have another option that maybe the government from that receiving country could absorb them and have them maybe to work, or have them to have the right documentation and maybe probably stay in that country as they would have wanted? Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne, for this question. I'm pretty sure it has to do with the laws of every country. So it has to do with the hosting, the laws of the hosting country in general, whether it's directly related to detention or they have other alternatives in order to prove that the migrant is documented, or give him also ways to be documented, amnesties or whatsoever. But I would also love to hear your comments and answers to Joanne's question as well. Meanwhile, if we can, Manfred, please go ahead.
Yes, my friends. Just to remember what happened 22 years ago, the year 2000, there was the first World Social Forum in Brazil, and occasion in which migrant leaders met in the social forum, and we were inside the conference hall, and you know, there was a lot of democracy inside. Then I crossed the road, and there was another building, and there was the Black Social Forum of Brazil, and they explained me they were not authorized culturally and also economically to participate to the social forum, to the World Social Forum. So at the beginning, to raise the question of what is migration. That was a movement that after grew very much on migration. At the beginning, it was a problem. It was a problem even talking to trade unions in my country, because they said, oh, foreigners are coming to steal our jobs. You are lowering the price of the labor, blah, 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 no? And then they discovered that, well, the next to trade unionized have to be the migrants, the most interested to be inside the trade union. And also the bureaucracy of trade unions started to move in responding to the needs of migrants. Now you find some migrants in the leading positions of trade unions, only some, only a few. And no trade unions have courage to elect some national secretary as an undocumented migrant working in sex work or something that we use every day. At this point, after we see what the business has been done of migrants, not only in the progressive clubs, but also, of course, in the conservative ones, they are always a tool for development. They are never target of development. If they are useful, if they don't cost too much, then we can make these projects. So what is at this point, we as NGOs, we as activists, what we have to do? We have to remember that authorities want from us the first legitimization. I spoke with civil society, and that's the people I have in front of me now. But the civil society, one of the biggest philosophers of the history, explained the civil society is the amount of the private interests of a society. So you also have to put everybody who is not the institution in that. And we have the companies. The companies are very well represented in the Global Compact, but not very well in the Council for Human Rights. That's why we have a double. What is not possible to fit in the Global Compact, we as NGOs, we remember when we go to the Council for Human Rights. And we put the same questions there, because there the contest is binding. And the documentation is centrally based, starting from human rights, not from partnerships of governments, contracts between two parts, and the rest of the world is secretly out. And this is now what is now the World Social Forum is nothing, because the Secretary General of the United Nations is the former Secretary General of the International Socialist Alliance. So the people feel more represented from institutions than from companies. Then our national lobby is important, because the Global Compact, we cannot solve our national lobby. And is important the lobby at Council for Human Rights, because the Global Compact cannot solve that. And is important our participation in any social forum, because the Global Compact is not representing them. So when this is clear, everybody has his things to do together, my friends.
Thank you, Manfred. Now, moving on, I will give the floor to Salmanou. Salmanou, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Salmanou Muhammad from Wazobia International Women and Children Foundation, Kano State. I really appreciate it for I really appreciate and support what she said. But my question is that we as a civil society organization, what strategies can we make or can we do to make sure we stop this detention of migration, especially in our country, because it's very, very critical, as you said, because some of the migration, some of the detention migrants, sometimes they used to keep them. Maybe when they keep them, they'll suffer them, do everything that it's not right. But please, what are the strategies can we make? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Salman. So I'm positive that there may be someone from the panelists would want to comment on what Salman just asked about the strategies as civil society that has to be taken in order to eradicate the detention processes. So anyone would want to comment on that?
Yes,
Sorry,
of course.
yeah, go on, Manfred.
Oh, please, Sumita, please, Sumita.
No, go on, Manfred, go on.
Everybody can do something. We have not to criminalize migrants, but also migrants, even inside these detention centers. They are excluded. Not only the migrants, but also the migrant social workers who are working there. They are focal points of legal orientation, language teaching, access to basic services, and we should train them and protect them, and we don't do it. So bilateral agreements that can ensure this could meet the favor of any NGOs, could save lives. Because when you have women in a detention center in the personnel, it's better. Because we have, when you have specialized doctors instead of bands, on the ground, this is something that, in which we respond with assistance for development. We try to develop the situation of the people who are in troubles. Then we go talking to the social tissue, so to all the shelters who can take care of the person so that he can be not decentered but inserted in a program of protection because we can prove that he is exploited from the employer or some other reason. No? So the social services should work so well that everybody finds his way and nobody goes to be detained. Are we able to do this? Yes, we must. There is no alternative. And services of integration means preventing prison, jail, but also detention of migrants because they are migrants. This is the point. This is the main point to underline. You cannot be jailed because you are migrant. This is very clear at the Council for Human Rights and must be very clear at the Global Compact on Migration, and must be very clear at the World Forum on Migration. No? This is the common points, central, that are starting from the human rights. In this, we cannot feed any ambiguity. No? So thank you, everybody.
Sorry, I just wanted to answer Gozi's question about why migrants, what should we do about migrants who come into the country irregularly. I think my response to that, Gozi, is to actually look at the root cause of why migrants migrate irregularly, even when there is a system of migration in the country. And I'm going to give you a few examples. Look at Indonesia. Indonesia has many migrants leaving the country, and we do a lot of rescue cases, and a lot of our rescue cases of traffic victim involves Indonesian workers. And I always ask this question to the workers: why have you chosen to come through an irregular manner and being trafficked this way when the country has a regular migration system? And the migrant will tell you that I can't even afford to pay for my passport. The passport cost in the country is so high, even the migrant can't even pay for that, that it has to depend on an agent or a trafficker to get them a passport. Look at Bangladesh. Bangladesh is one of the largest migrant producing countries in South Asia. but it saw it fit to just choose 10 recruitment agents, and it became a cartel, right? And these 10 recruitment agents were charging the Bangladeshi migrants an exorbitant USD 5,000 to migrate out of the country. Whose fault is that? Was it the migrant whose fault? They had no choice. They have to pay that money if they wanted to migrate. Look at Myanmar. Myanmar is one of the largest refugee producing country in Southeast Asia, right? But we have in Malaysia, we have almost 90% of our refugees in the country are from Myanmar. But Malaysia still does business with Myanmar. It does not question why Myanmar is pushing out their citizens. It doesn't question all that, but it still continues to do business with Myanmar. So whose fault is that? So it's easy to say that why is the migrant migrating when all the systems are in place? The system is in place, but it's not accessible. It's not affordable. These are the reasons why some migrants migrate irregularly. Yeah.
Ngozi, is this an old hand? Thank you, Sumita, first of all. Ngozi, is this an old hand or you want to take the floor?
Yeah, I want to take the floor. I just want to ask, I just want to ask, continue from where the previous person stopped, who asked about the approaches used. So I think Ms. Hannah could have been in the best position to talk about this. So if there are approaches, how do we measure the successes and failures of the approaches so that remedies could be made to improve if it's the ATD or some other strategies? How do we measure the successes and failures? If anybody in the panel can take up the question, that would be nice. Thank you. And also talking about the root causes, talking about the root causes of migration, which Dr. Sumata has just mentioned. I'm so passionate about international arms deal because that is the main problem that is causing refugee situation in Africa. And it is part of it's a major concern in migration governance. So if it could be tackled, I don't think so many Africans will be leaving the continent, risking their life to get to somewhere else. The arms that are supplied here are used to cause all sorts of problems. The money that is supposed to use for socio-economic development of the people is used to purchase arms. It's used by rebels to fight the government. So, thank you.
Thank you, Ngozi. So anyone of the panelists would like to comment about how to measure success within the ATD measures? Meanwhile, let's hear what Manfred has to say. Please, Manfred, go ahead.
I was thinking about a reflection that is different. May I answer to a question that I will raise? The problem is when I was young, we divided the NGOs into non-profit enterprises providing services. And then there were the NGOs working for human rights. This was the second group. Find a job, you go to the first one. If you want to work as a diplomat, you go to the second one. Then there was separate careers. There were social workers coming from the hippies or priests working with migrants locally. And this was local cooperation, social cooperation, okay? Then there was and this was the experts and the diplomats, and they never have to mix. They taught us at universities, social workers never have to meet experts of human rights, because this is different job. There is no contact with the so-called field, with the so-called users, with the so-called roots. So reflecting on this language, also have to reflect in problems like what is the difference between an expat and then a migrant worker. If you are a German in Italy, you are an expat. If you are an Italian in Germany, you are a migrant. Why? Because this is not the language of United Nations. This is not the language of human rights. Okay? Everybody is migrant. What is the root of Europeans who are all over the world? Work, culture, love, many root causes. What are the root causes of the people who are coming from poor countries? Poverty, but also democracy, also culture, yes, and development, a lot of development that has to be studied. Development help in the world is the remittances of migrants. All the rest is a few things. So at the beginning of the Global Forum for Migration, there were countries so crazy to ask for a double taxation of migrants' remittances. And there was Sweden who knocked on the table and said, you never tax them. These were the best promises of the Global Compact of Migration, to explain to the business world what is the things that governments cannot do. Because human rights, when you defend the human rights, must be clear what the government cannot do. And the government cannot detain a person because he's a migrant. Be very, 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 very clear.
Thank you, Manfred. Thank you for shedding the light about how important it is to unify the language around migration, but also to have binding rules in terms of governmental approach, in terms of migration, and what can and cannot be done in terms of human rights. Michael, please go ahead.
I think Binod Kadria, I don't know if I'm pronouncing him, I think he was asking to say something a while ago. So I'll come back in after he has the chance to speak, if that's okay.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Judy. Well, it's so inspiring. This whole session has been so rich that I better be listening rather than talking. But thank you for giving me that opportunity. I think this whole thing began with the terminology, with language, with concepts, which is extremely, extremely important. And we don't give much importance to that. Particularly when you all spoke about detention, I started, reflecting and thinking that detention is the ultimate outcome. It is the product, but there is a whole process leading to that outcome. The process of detention does not does not begin or end with locking up with ankle bracelets and so on, but that's the end. So where does it begin? It begins with the visa. It begins with the permission to enter the country. That's where it begins. And visa has always been a hot potato in multilateral negotiations. Nobody even raises it. That I think it's in the name of sovereignty. You have mentioned about that, and that I think needs to be questioned. That why not discuss visa? Because ultimately it is visa violations that leads to detention and other considerations. And one very important point that has come up, second point, I have just 3 points. So second one is about the discrimination. Diplomatic immunity. What is diplomatic immunity? Manfred had also mentioned, and Sumita has mentioned about the business and things like that. That is where the discrimination begins. And diplomatic immunity is one thing that, divides the society between the rulers and the ruled. So who are the diplomats? Why are they free from these kind of situations where they may be questioned? I don't want to raise issues, but there is a very recent example of the COVID testing, the anal swab that is being, taken of in some country of other countries' diplomats. And that is one thing which is hitting the dignity of the people, the question that is being raised. And it is ironical that the country which exercised this says that, no, we have not done it, or because we have a bilateral relation of diplomatic immunities, that diplomats would be immune from this. Because if there is something else happens, that you will have another process of detention, not in the jail, but perhaps in the hospital. That I think is extremely important, that in the context of COVID-19, we are also using that as a matter of detention. So I think it is extremely important to bring the entire process where it begins in terms of allowing migrants and refugees. And that's my last point, where you said that the migrants and refugees, this is the divide and rule policy. Put them into different silos so that they do not get united and can, make you do what is important. Thank you very much for this couple of minutes.
Thank you so much, Professor Binod. Thank you for your intervention. That is very valuable. Michael, over to you, please.
Yeah, I'll come back to what you've said, Binod, in a moment, because I think you make a good point, but I think it also misses a couple things that get left out there. But regarding the question of how do you measure the impact of ATDs, I think, in fact, that is a critical question in all of this, because it depends on who you're talking to and what your objectives are. Okay, so let's just lay this out real clearly. It's critical that we understand this. In the context of the European Union, okay, where the concept of alternative to detention, even if often that exact terminology is not used, the concept of, as I've been discussing it and using it today, is really well in place and very legally defined. It's basically set up to say, are there other measures that we can use short of detention to achieve the objectives of our immigration or asylum laws? Okay, so from the perspective of that legal framework for detention measures, immigration-related detention measures in the European Union, when you talk about how do you measure the impact or success of ATDs, that's the measure that they're looking at the European Union is looking at. They're looking at how effective have these measures been in assisting states in every case where we put someone in an alternative to detention measure. And let's come back to this question in a minute. What are we talking about? We're talking about homes in the community. There's lots of different things that people can do that can be called ATDs. And in some places it's to give some money and you can be out of detention, you get the money back, when your procedure's over. Other countries have, there's homes that they set up in the community where you have to stay at until your procedure's over. Others are ankle bracelets in the United States. There's a whole range of different things short of placing a person in a cell. Okay, but the way in which you measure the success of ATDs is whether or not everyone you've placed in whatever that measure is, whether or not the country could, at the end of the procedure, say we successfully got the objective we wanted. Okay, and so that's one measure, right? But I think from the perspective of what we're talking about today, civil society, when we think about ATDs, I think there's only one measure we should be looking at, and that is how well did it prevent states from placing people in detention in the first place, right? Can we come up with some way of measuring, oh, look, we've got ATDs over in Mexico, and we know that if we hadn't had those ATDs, it wouldn't be 50,000 people that were detained last year, it would be only 5,000. Well, that would be amazing, right? That would be great. Let's find, if you could find that kind of measure between the one thing and the other, if you could find the mechanism that was happening there and track it and come up with the evidence and count it, great. Unfortunately, the campaign on ATDs. The global campaign is very far from coming up with anything that you can measure. And part of the problem is they don't want to define what they mean by ATDs. Let me pull out what the definition is in the global campaign, okay? And this is what's in mind, keep this in mind. This is what is in mind for a lot of states also that are part of the GCM. They say that it is any law, policy, or practice by which persons are not detained for reasons related to their migration status. Let's think about that definition for a minute. What does that mean exactly? Well, it means anything at all. It could mean, in fact, that you have some women like in Mexico where they're providing shelter to some people so they can hide from the police. That could be an ATD according to that definition. My point here is not that there's a definitional problem. There is. My point here is, though, if you don't define what you're talking about, you cannot measure it. You can't.
Yeah.
You don't know whether or not ATDs mean something in one place or another because you don't even know what it means. It's everything and anything under the sun, anything. So, that is a real challenge. Maybe ATDs make sense in certain contexts, maybe, maybe not, we don't know, but are they successful? Maybe, maybe not, we don't know, because how do you actually sit down to measure it? So that's a big problem. Okay, so I'll set that question aside for a minute. Now, Binod, what you had mentioned is that detention is the ultimate outcome, but that's actually not the case. Let's be clear here. The ultimate outcome, for the most part, is the removal of somebody from society. That's the ultimate outcome, okay? So in places like Australia, that means mandatory indefinite detention for people who can't be removed. Well, they're disappeared forever, and they don't even have an option to get the hell out. Yeah. So that is the objective here is the disappearance of that person from society, and they don't come back. Now, in most, to put a word on it, mature immigration systems, they're maybe not very mature, but I mean, they've aged and they've developed rules and regulations for why they operate. The objective here is the removal of the person from the country, okay? And so you need to be able to put them in detention as an intermediate measure to ensure that they get deported, okay? So that's your ultimate objective in that case. And I think it's really important we keep this in mind, because talking about outcomes here is really going to tell us a lot about, well, what are we trying to do in any case here? And I think it does come back to this idea of trying to prevent people from going in detention in the first place. And this comes back to the last point, and I'll stop, is visas. You mentioned visas, and it's not only about visas. It's not just a visa procedure, right? It's a procedure of what happens when you have a mass irregular movement across the border, right? As we see when you look at the situation in Myanmar, right, and Bangladesh. Where you have, it could be in Central America, in El Salvador, and a movement of people that are coming up. I mean, it could be all kinds of situations where the procedure is a messy one, because visas are not really a question at this point. It's how do you deal with mass movements of people across borders irregularly in a state is going to want to control that, which states will always want to do. So how do you do it in a way that's somehow humane and also builds confidence that the state feels it's controlling its borders? And I don't think there's an easy answer to this question, right? It's very difficult. I think what we're trying to come up with here, I think a lot of people, the big concern is labor migration, right? It's a labor. And so how are people in labor migration situations losing their visas? And I think why that's maybe the focus on visas here, because people are losing their visa and it's not in their control, it's in the control of the employer. And that in detention obviously is the real big boogeyman there behind that is used to make migrant laborers afraid, So anyhow, it's hard to boil things down to what is the ultimate outcome, but I think detention is in some extent an intermediary to the ultimate. Yeah. But anyhow, okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So thank you, Michael. We will hear now from Manfred and then Sumita, and then I guess we are a bit running out of time, so we'll be concluding after Sumita. Please, Manfred, go ahead.
I find amazing this debate, because more we talk, more the problems are going into deeper. How to measure the well-being of people. Well, the teaching Nobel of Economy, who is Amartya Sen, is insisting on three basic dimensions. The first one is health. The second one is education. The third one is income. So we have the three dimensions of the well-being of the people. And this is the three accredited dimensions at the Council for Human Rights of the United Nations, because all the recommendation development programs are going to that direction. So the direction is that one. The Global Compact knows, every NGO that works in the sector knows, and all the projects are coherent to those targets. And who makes the opposite is working against the United Nations, human rights, and the rest, no? Very clearly. No? How to, if you are closed in a place and you cannot go out, you can measure this. Then the problem will change depending on from the point of view. A judge, when he says that you go to prison, he does not condemn to the fact that in your prison the water, he does not condemn to the fact that in your prison you can be assaulted. He does not condemn you to the fact that in your prison you can be infected. He does not condemn you that you go to prison and you die. But this happens, and the judge knows, and he is the best person to decide if you will go to jail or not, the first policeman on the road. So this is the centrality of human rights. This is the difference from arbitrary detention to legal detention. And this cannot change, never, because this is the basic human rights. No? Then providing services to governments who want to improve the situation. Yes, this is what we have to do. But please remember always this. We offer them values and techniques, but the government will only accept our techniques, and our values are always refused. The value that a migrant cannot be detained because he is a migrant is the value that we should support. But what the governments want in the global techniques for managing, that's different. Defending human rights is not always only managing. This is another thing that explained Amartya Sen, this Nobel Prize for Economy. He said, hey, you know, human rights have to be defended every day in different dimensions, no? And you can measure, you can Bhutan makes, but you can measure the well-being of the people. If they are making a good and healthy life in that detention center, if they are studying, learning something, if they are having information with outside or not, you can measure this. And you can also measure the income of these people and the expenses that they are going to face for being repatriated life. There have been even programs for the reintegration, and I remember people who after 1 week were back in Rome. So what I have to say, you can spend 20,000 euros for a reintegration that after a week is finished, and you can spend 250 euros per day for one person detained, while waiting for a charter that will arrive after 2 months, euros a day, and you spend 12 euros a day for a child at school. Where is better to invest? So bilateral agreements have to start from the respect of human rights, from the satisfaction of human rights. Nobody has a good agreement with Libya for the improvement of their jails. This is what we need. Are they in the Global Compact? No, catch them in the Council for Human. So the strategy is very complex, but we started to mix social workers and experts of human rights. And this is something that maybe will produce something good in the future.
Sumita, we will be concluding with you, so please go ahead. Michael, is this an old hand or you wish to say something more? So,
okay,
yeah, I'm guessing this is an old hand. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to make 2 points because thank you for Binod for touching on discrimination, and an incident came into mind on that. During the pandemic, there was no flights, borders were closed. There was no travel agent, operating. And I remember we had many migrants who were stuck in detention who had served their sentence. And at that time, the embassies were only allowed to have chartered flights. You couldn't have scheduled flights, but countries were allowed to have chartered flights to fly out their citizens. And I remember that it was next to impossible to get a flight for a migrant in detention. We tried so many times to get tickets, seats for migrants who are in detention, and they were just not the priority. And a lot of the embassies told us that no, we were busy flying out our tourists, our citizens who are stuck in this country as tourists, business travelers, and so on. But migrants in detention had to wait. And we had a lot of arguments with the embassies because we're saying that people that you mentioned their liberty was intact. But these people that I'm talking about have their liberty taken away from them. So look at the priority sometimes the government has, And secondly, when we talk about detention, we must also talk about the stigma that is attached to detention. When migrants go home, deported back home, a lot of time, the migrant faces the stigma of society in their country. And this is very, very true in Asian context, because society doesn't know how to differentiate between a migrant who is detained in immigration or detained as a criminal in a normal prison. They just look at the detention as something that is bad, and this person is a criminal. That's it. So the migrant goes back and has to face that kind of stigma. And mind you, as a sending country, when we deport people back to their home country, we don't allow them back into this country again. There's either a 5-year ban, or sometimes it's a lifelong ban. Even the country of origin, when the migrant comes back deported, they also impose a ban on the migrant to remigrate. So the migrant's prospect of remigrating to another country is also diminished because he's come back on a deportation. So these are things that is attached to the detention. And that's something that we also must take into context, the stigma that is, and the difficulty that the migrant faces when he goes back to the home country as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sumita. So I will conclude briefly because we are a bit running out of time. So this has been very insightful. Thank you for everyone. To conclude briefly, and as mentioned throughout our discussions, we have seen that there has been a global effort to stop this growth of detention of migrants through a campaign called, as we discussed, Alternative to Detention. Yet this campaign is not really positive and does not really provide positive impact on the migrant situation, because we are building and emphasizing on detention rather than building and emphasizing on liberty and the right to freedom. So I think we can all agree on the fact that freedom remains the best alternative to detention. I really want to thank you all. I want to thank our panelists especially. So Sunita, Michael, and Manfred, thank you so much for your very insightful interventions. Thank you for everyone who took the floor and also made this talk very much insightful. Thank you for the organizers, the Cross-Regional Center for Refugees and Migrants, CCRM, the Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism, GRFTD, International Institute for Migration and Development, IIMAD, Metropolis Asia Pacific MAP, Migrant Forum in Asia, MFA. Thank you, Paddy, and thank you for all the participants and attendees. Have a good evening, good day, depending on where you are.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Thank you to all our panelists, Michael, Manfred, Sumita, thank you very much.
Thank you, Paddy.
And for the students, we will see you again on Saturday for the lecture.
Thank you, Paddy.